Aidan McCullen joins us to talk about how he transformed himself, first from an unpromising athlete into a successful professional rugby player, and then into a digital business leader, and now a thought leader, as he discusses a mindset of permanent reinvention in his book, Undisruptable.
Hey folks, welcome to the Evolving Leader Podcast. I'm Scott Allender.
And I'm John Gomes.
How are you feeling today, John?
I am feeling on it, Scott.
Well, you sound it. I'm confident in you today. Yeah.
Thank you. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling good for a Monday morning, ready to take on the week. Excited to jump into this show with our guest, because today we are joined by retired Ireland National Rugby Union team player and current international businessman, thought leader, author, host of the Innovation Show, and award-winning facilitator and speaker, Aidan McCullen. Aidan is driven by his passion for human potential. He works to empower people and organizations to be the absolute best they can be. He believes that the best way to learn is to create an enjoyable learning environment, so his talks and his workshops are known for their fun as well as their educational value. And he is the author of Undisruptable, a mindset of permanent reinvention for individuals, organizations, and life. Aidan, welcome to the Evolving Leader.
Scott, John, great to be with you. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Of course. So can we start with a quick tour of your career, how you've gone from rugby to award-winning speaker and now author?
A lot of failure, a lot of mistakes. The failure started at a young age on the playground. So, I played professional sport, like you mentioned, but oftentimes people associate that with being talented. And I'm not being humble here, I was far from a talented kid. I was a very clumsy child, often last picked in the playground, and actually kids would try and get me on the other team so the other team would lose. That was their way of actually trying to win. So over time I kept persisting, kept going back. I went from sport to sport because we play in Ireland. We have a native football game, Gaelic football. We also have a game of hurling with sticks. We go around with these sticks and a leather ball. And I played all those sports, and I had ambitions in those sports, but never really made it. And then a pivotal moment came where I had to go to a school that played rugby, and I had a big fight with my parents, didn't want to go, went there, and it absolutely changed my life. I kind of failed my way into a sport that eventually accepted me, and around 16 years age or so, I just started going, actually, I'm going to go for this, I'm going to do it. And the serendipity of that was many Irish males discovered the power and maybe the poison of alcohol around that age. And when they discovered that, I discovered rugby, and I started to go for it big time, started to train really hard. And many schoolboy heroes just fell away from the sport, and I stepped up a little bit more and got onto the Irish junior team, so the national team for under 18s, the schoolboy team. And from there, just got into the academy and the underage system, and that gave me a real desire to see that actually the hard work pays off when you're driven by vision. So that was a real early lesson for me. But then the next biggest lesson that happened to me was at the end of your rugby career. So I went on to have an amazing time in rugby. I had many failures, many setbacks, many obstacles. I played for two of the best teams in Europe, which are Stade Toulouse in France, and Leinster here in Ireland. And I even had a little stint in London Irish over there, and had an amazing time. But the end of my career always comes for any rugby player, any sports player, and that taught me actually you have to reinvent yourself. But what I was lucky about was that I had been injured so much towards the end of my career that I prepared for the inevitable decline, the inevitable reinvention. And so I'd done a lot of work, discovered burgeoning industries, burgeoning areas that I could learn from, and entered into the workplace running. So I hit the ground running, and that was a really early, great lesson for me. And really, Scott, I applied that to everything after that. It was like one of the concepts I talk about in my book is build capability before you need it. So you never know how things will materialize for you later in life. I see behind you, you have a beautiful guitar. And one of the things I did when at the end of my career was I took a course in a music college in London called Point Blank Studios. And I didn't know why I was taking it, except that I had this spare time, this spare capacity. And I took that lesson, did music editing, put some very dodgy songs together. And through that, years later, that manifested in my own podcast, which was able to chop it up, edit it, etc., understand how to do that, how to master the sound, etc., etc. And it's just, that's an example of how things you do in the past that you may seemingly forget about pay off massively in the future. And if we're deliberate about that in a world of absolute change, we can do that. So I've done that with everything. Started writing 6 years ago, weekly articles for my own learning perspective. That then manifested into the book that you mentioned. You mentioned speaking as well, so speaking at events, etc. I started doing them for free, begging to speak at industry events just to get my muscle built up, my speaking muscle. And then that manifests into doing keynotes all over the world and running workshops. So it's just I think it's such a valuable way to think, and that's why I wanted to share it in this book.
So we talk quite a lot on this show about topics of mindset from lots of different perspectives and uncertainty, and we've explored it from a neuroscientist perspective with guests such as Dr. Bo Lotto, from an economics perspective with John Kay, from a psychological and futurist lens. So we're delighted you're here. You've done a beautiful job in your book of articulating mindset as a cornerstone of becoming undisruptable. You've started to explore that a little bit. Can you share with our listeners what led you to write the book? In practical terms, what are you giving people? What is a mindset of permanent reinvention?
Well, as you can see behind me here, and for those of our audience who are just listening, I have a lot of books, and it's not to show my intelligence, actually, it's to show the opposite of it. So I'm a voracious reader, and I wasn't all my life, by the way. So I started reading about 10 years ago because I realized that I had so much more to learn. And then that manifested into the podcast, where I get, like you, interview these authors every week, read the book before I interview them. So I kind of have to force myself to read in order to ask decent questions. And over the years, that all that knowledge comes in as an input. And I think you're forced some way to output that. It's like, you're filling with air and you need to breathe out. And I think that was really a driver. Was I had absorbed so much information, and often not very nicely designed information. So it was very academic, very framework based. And I was like, okay, how can I make this digestible and synthesize it for people so they understand it? So message sent equals message received. And how can I apply that to life, that people see in this age of unbelievable change that we're going through? And the pandemic has only accelerated this change, that they can see simple frameworks through simple stories and analogies and metaphors from nature, that they can see actually change is an absolutely normal part of life. And if we embrace it and get ahead of it, we can actually enjoy life more, less stress, and actually embrace the change when it inevitably happens. And I wanted to share that framework, and particularly from somebody from not an extreme academic background, that applied it in my own life in many ways. Although I don't dive too much into my own life in it, it's just, I wanted to make it simple, because if you're stressed about it, you're going to think about it differently. It's like an organization waiting until the burning platform's almost at their toes before they go and make a difference. It's if you're embracing that change and read the patterns that are always in the chaos, you can get ahead of the change and you can enjoy it when the tide turns, and actually learn to surf rather than build sandcastles on the beach.
So have you always had this mindset of building capability before you needed it, or was the, sort of the sunset of your rugby career the inflection point, or did it just build on what was already in you? I'm just really curious about that.
Yeah, I was a curious kid. I was a kind of I'm from the country, so I lived literally like most Irish towns. It had a pub that was also a shop. So I lived in a very remote part of Ireland for a long time. And I was always fascinated by nature, and curious, why do the wasps do that? Why, how do bees sting you? I'll pick it up and then it gets stung. So I learned from experience, and I always had that curiosity. And I wasn't a very articulate or social kid, as in that I wasn't the center of attention in any way. So I had to learn those skills growing up, particularly when I moved to Dublin, the capital here in Ireland, to try and master how to get on in society, etc., because it was a very different experience when I moved up to Dublin from the small town I'm from. And I think that probably experience of change, of scenery, and such a dramatic change from a very quiet place to a noisy place was useful. And I think maybe I've created a story there looking back in the past that goes, well, that's how I made sense of that. But I recently had it with my own son. So my younger son has moved school. We made him think it was his choice, right? And then we actually celebrate him constantly to go, well done on being so brave to make that change. I mean, being able to reinvent or be able to adjust yourself and be agile with your mindset, what a fantastic skill to have. And I think somebody even saying that to you helps you actually believe it, particularly when you're a child. And maybe somebody said something to me as a kid, Scott, I don't know, but I always had a desire to keep striving for more, and that can trip you up as well. I know you guys know that, where you can become addicted to just keep going and never stop to smell the roses. I certainly didn't do that during rugby. Definitely didn't ever stop and go, wow, this is amazing, I'm so lucky. I was always constantly going for the next thing. And I truly believe that's why I got injured quite a lot. I got injured quite a lot in the sport because I was always pushing myself almost too hard instead of actually just enjoying it sometimes and reflecting on what I already had. And that was a very valuable lesson. So I think it was in me. And then, as you say, the tipping point was having to reinvent in sport. But when I did reinvent, I worked in digital transformation for almost a decade. And that decade flew past. And I was deliberate about getting out of that industry as well. Firstly, because it was a melting iceberg. But apart from that, I felt there was no more space to learn. There was no more growth in that position for me. The next role was to be the CEO of the media group. And that didn't appeal to me at all. So I was like going, why do people stay? Why do people stay here and do that? And maybe they become addicted to the power and maybe the salaries that they're on, but certainly I didn't feel I was growing, and I felt if I wasn't growing I'd start to die inside, and that's why I keep moving and keep trying to reinvent myself.
Well, let's build on the reinvention. You said something a few moments ago, which I love. You know, we can ride the wave, or we can try to build the sandcastles to block the rising tide. So this notion of VUCA, and for those listening that may not know what that acronym is, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, has been around really since the Reagan administration. But it seems to me that while it was true in a more academic sense back in the 80s and 90s, it wasn't really the level of pressing reality that it is today. Now, correct me if I'm wrong about that, but how do you see VUCA changing, and can anyone afford to ignore this reality in today's world, and what are the potential consequences of ignoring it?
Well, on a personal level, I think that there's no more climb to the top of the ladder in your career and protect yourself once you're there. I think, firstly, when you do that, when you become defensive in your mindset, you start to deflect new information. So you become a total victim of confirmation bias. And as you know from your show, the more information you hear that you already know, you get a dopamine hit. So you become addicted to having people around you who become the sycophants and just tell you how great you are for knowing what you know. And that happens in organizations all the time, and that becomes addictive for people in power. So the status quo, by its very nature, will resist change. So I think because of what you said, the VUCA world, which is getting faster, and I think the thing we don't understand is we look back on the past at an industrial age, and yes, we know 88% of the Fortune 500 is gone now. 50% of the S&P 500 will be gone by the year 2027. We know these kind of figures, but we don't really understand why that's happened. And I think it's because as the world becomes more and more digital and technologically driven, the speed of change in the processing powers and AI, artificial intelligence, is getting so much more powerful and faster and cheaper and more accessible and more widespread, that people are getting replaced. And they think in their heads, when they think about that, they think about things like memes like Terminator, the Terminator's eyesight coming for you. While it's much less sexy than that, it's a simple computer sitting on a desk where your friend Fred used to sit, and that person's been replaced. We've seen this in our careers. You know, there's a term called cobots, where we work with the robots. And I think people go, okay, well, in the past, when automation has come in, it's created new jobs. I think the difference this time, it's a little bit like playing musical chairs. The chairs are going to run out because the power of the computers and power of AI is getting so powerful that's replacing people. And there are no more jobs for them afterwards because everything's becoming digitized. And that's where people are getting tricked, because they will train the machine for a while until the machine knows how to do it better than you. And then all that remains are the human skills. And that's why I'm a big fan of what you guys do with your podcast, sharing knowledge out there to share to people how they can think about things differently, because just even some new information can change their mindset. You know, your mindset, essentially the software. Our brain is only 200,000 years ago since we emerged from the caves. And that's hardware. That takes a long time to evolve. But what you can be deliberate about is updating your software, and that's mindset. And I think when you do that and you bring in new information and you challenge yourself and you look for the dissenting voice, you can update yourself and really see the gaps in your strategy as an organization, but also in your role as an individual. Where am I weak? Where can I add new capabilities so I can be... It's, you know, there's an old story about two natives outrunning a tiger, and one of them stops to tie his lace, and the other guy has no shoes on, and it's like going, what are you doing? There's a tiger chasing. He's going, I just need to outrun you because the tiger's going to get one of us and stop. And I often think about that, about AI, is that tying your lace is the equivalent of actually sharpening the saw, bringing in some new skills that are going to be coveted in the future. Those more human skills, collaboration, empathy, communication skills, thought leadership, doing what you're doing here, the podcast, bringing in new information. That's all really important stuff that will at least give you a bit more longevity and help you outrun some other people in your organization.
So I want to hone in on something around mindset and what you've learned about it, because in all of this ability to confront a huge amount of change that we're experiencing is our sense of identity. Now, your sense of identity, you formed completely on your own, by the sounds of it, as a rugby player. You weren't a natural athlete. You weren't somebody who was fated at school and everybody went, yeah, Aidan's a great athlete, and you created that identity for yourself. So that's a really interesting starting point. And then you've changed it at least twice since, if maybe more, I don't know. But let's talk about that in terms of what does it take, because I think that probably sits at the core of your undisruptable thinking here. How do you kind of get really aware of who you are, and then figure out how to move it forward so that you're not defending some previous sense of yourself?
That's a really great question, and it's probably in the book as well, John, where I talk about stuff like managing contrasts and overcoming obstacles, overcoming fear, because through my work, and I'm sure you guys are the same with your work with organizations, that one of the biggest blockers to change for people is fear of change. Like there's an amazing study that shows that people, despite having debilitating heart or cardiovascular surgeries, when they're told to change their lifestyle, only 9% of people are capable of making the changes, and that's their life. And then we wonder why 75% of transformation efforts fail in organizations, because somebody won't change things to live. And we're asking them to change so we have better organizations, better profit margins. No wonder things don't change. I think the fear of change is such a blocker. And it really saddens me that actually when I see it. And I really don't know where I didn't have that fear of change. And that's why I go back to Scott's earlier question, which is perhaps maybe from the early intervention in my life where I had to actually up sticks and move to a different town and meet new people and start all over again. Maybe that was useful. I'm not sure. But I think the becoming used to the familiarity of things is safety for people. But the thing about that is you create a very closed worldview. And, you know, I know mindset's a huge thing for you, John. I think it's like wearing one set of spectacles for the rest of your life that even though your eyesight might change, it's blurry and, you know, you start to see everything through that set of spectacles instead of actually going, oh, I need my eyesight has changed, it's got better here, or it's got worse, so I need to change my lenses, etc. Or another way of thinking about that is how so many of us live walking through life with a Zippo or a cigarette lighter looking in a very narrow view instead of turning on the floodlights and going, wow, there's a load of stuff here that I've never experienced. And I think having an appetite to row your own boat and not be driven by other people. I mean, the amount of, I lecture in Trinity College here in Dublin. I created a module there and I lecture to these students who are 20 to 30 years old, and I can tell so many of them are doing what is expected of them. They're not doing what they want to do. And I saw that even in my own college. One of the great things for me was that my parents were not very helpful when I was like going, I don't know what to do, you know, as an 18-year-old. Who knows what to do as an 18-year-old? Very few of us. So I went into the arts. I did French and German, and then I did a business degree at the end. But it wasn't with a clear view of who I wanted to be. But then you look at society, and society teaches you, oh, you need to have a fancy car, and measurement comes in how much salary you have and how big your house is. And I think that's a terrible message that is driven into our minds in society versus it's about how happy you are, how much you can nurture new children, new life into the world and actually give a mindset to them. So then they go and they enjoy their lives to the happiest they can. Like one of the things I ask my kids and have drilled into their minds is when you ask them what they want to be when they grow up, they say happy, because that's a better answer than I want to be, you know, astronaut or whatever kids come up with these days, whatever the kids are saying these days. And I think that's such an important thing. Back to what you said, I actually believe for me, the rugby part was driven by ego. When I look back on it, it wasn't really me at all. And what I loved was the ability to be keeping in great shape. You know, the fans, the name in the newspaper, and that becomes slightly addictive. Now, I wasn't anyway a very famous player, but that lifestyle was very addictive, very seductive. And I genuinely think that was ego driven. And that's why I think I got injured all the time, because it's almost like the universe going, this isn't for you. Come on, man, get out of it. Do something else. And I see those signals of resistance in our lives as signals of it's time to do something else, man. It's not work. This is not your path. Do something else. And I think what a great way to just be like Tarzan swinging from vine to vine of life and kind of go, okay, I'll try on this person and see if it works for me. And then I'll do it for something else and see if that works for me. Or even better, I'll do multiple of them at the same time to see which one works for me. So I don't have a huge loss of income or a huge loss of identity. I can let go of stuff gently. And that's the whole idea that Scott mentioned earlier on about building capability before you need it. Because then when you need it, it's like if the rug is pulled from under your feet, there's already another rug there waiting for you. So you're in charge. I think that's a really important aspect of this.
As you look at your children, you know, I love the ambition for them to be happy, but what, in a world of AI, when, you know, I have a Scott bot instead of Scott here, you know.
Which he secretly wants.
I've already got one, actually. But,
the real Scott's off getting a coffee.
It's you. You just had your consciousness uploaded to this avatar. You just don't realize it.
No wonder I'm thinking such fond things about you today.
Yeah, dial that up. Seriously, though, given the place that machine learning automation is going to have in our kids' lives, what are you thinking about in terms of those human skills? Because a lot's being talked about, empathy, problem solving, relationship forming. But are we thinking radically enough about that? Because a lot of that can be automated as well. I mean, at the moment, terribly, admittedly. But where do we go with that? Do you think for future generations?
I think what you said there is right. Admittedly, terribly now, and that tricks us as well. So we know about exponential change. Everything, you think about chips in a computer, they double in power, half in size and half in price every 12 to 18 months. Moore's law. But now that's even been replaced by quantum computing. We've seen Apple have the new M1 chip in the computers, so things are getting even faster. 5G networks haven't even happened yet. So when we have connectivity problems, they're not going to be an issue in the future. So it's something that I've looked a lot into, John, and I spoke to many people, as you know, and I gathered kind of just little bits of knowledge, like a patchwork quilt of knowledge, to try and form my own view. Some of the things that changed for me, maybe that's a good way to start, where I used to think of gaming as this evil thing, not evil, but not very good for my kids to be that much screen time. But then I realized actually not all screen time is created equal. So some of the analogies that I used in the book in Undisruptable actually came from my son, from him watching YouTube. He watches a channel on nature, and he actually shared stuff with me, and I was like, oh, that's a brilliant idea. So his name should actually be on the book, some of the great metaphors he gave me. And what I try to do with the kids is catch them doing something right, and then try and correlate it to a future version of themselves. So, one of the presuppositions of NLP, of neuro-linguistic programming, is the whole idea of kind of the future self. And what I try to do is use language of them in the future, talking back to this moment being a key moment for that success that they've had, and kind of going, what you did there is pattern recognition. You're probably going, these poor kids. So that's pattern recognition, right? And they're going, oh, here he goes again. And I go, so pattern recognition is a really important skill in the future. And because you did that, you're sitting doing something that you're really happy in the future, and you'll think back and going, oh yeah, I remember that pattern recognition moment. And I try to catch them doing stuff like that, where I try and give them a reason. Like I'll bring it to another analogy here. When I was coaching, when I retired from rugby, I coached for a while, and I say I had to because I started off as an intern. So you go from being on a very good salary as a professional rugby player to you go from, supposed hero, if you are one, to zero, essentially salary wise. So you go, you're starting again, chief. Nobody cares who you are, because we see all the heroes retiring, and they might get brand ambassador roles, etc., but there's not many. There's a load of other guys, 95%, who have to go and make it again. So that's a really good lesson, because you have to be hungry as heck. And one of the things that happened for me was I was coaching rugby, and I used to always myself with training go, coach. I was frustrated about a lot of stuff. Like going, why do the coaches have a physical fitness coach separate from the coach, and they don't bring them together and go, the reason you do this exercise is so that you do this on the pitch. So I got all the weights out on the pitch all the time, and I used to show the guys, you do this exercise at clean, for example, because that equates to bursting through a tackle. And I could see them kind of going like this, and then the gym was full all of a sudden, because they could see the value in why they're doing it. They didn't see them as separate things anymore. And that's something then I brought into my children, is kind of what skills can I catch them doing to emphasize and go, that was really, really good there. For example, coding. So one of my sons is looking at coding. I tell him coding will be done by robots in the future, be done by AI way better than you can do. But what you're doing is actually developing an understanding so you can work with the robots and actually become the creator and tell it what to do. That's a really good skill. Another example would be, I was mentioning gaming. So gaming for me was this waste of screen time. And then I actually saw it differently. I went, okay, if the patterns are telling us in a VUCA world that things will be so fast and computers will be seamless, you can imagine the virtual world the kids will operate in. So we're connected here on a virtual platform. They'll be on those platforms collaborating. So they need collaboration, communication skills. They need empathy to understand what the other person's saying and be able to truly understand it to save time. But they'll probably even look at data through amazing worlds like we see with the graphics in Fortnite, etc. And they'll be able to navigate that world. So it's a skill they're building to be able to navigate that world in the future. The key then is obviously to not overdo it and not let them spend all their time there, but make them realize actually what you're doing there, talking to your friends on Fortnite, having a game together, whatever games the kids play, you are creating good communication skills on a virtual platform, being able to make sure that they understand what you're talking about because you're on the same team against the zombies or whatever way they work. I think those kind of things are really important.
Yeah. So let's shift that to an organizational context. How can leaders today help the people on their team start to develop these crucial skills before they need them?
I think first, Scott, there's a huge onus on the individual. I think I live by this principle of and I, by the way, I don't mean this in a preachy way. I mean this because I did it wrong all the time. When you point the finger, there's 3 pointing back at yourself. Many individuals and organizations would go, sure, the company doesn't know that we don't have a vision or a mission statement, etc. And you kind of go, well, what's yours? And then they go quiet. And I think, for example, I was writing an article about this, so I do some very limited amount of executive coaching, just because I find it actually quite draining. So I only keep 4 clients at any one time. But I make them do what I call a to-be list before a to-do list. Because if you do executive coaching, what you'll have is the coachee will always push you to go, what can I do? How can I get better? Etc. Right? I've done it myself in the past. And the first question is like, well, what's your purpose and what are you about? What's your values? And nobody wants to do that at the start because it's bloody hard. It's really hard work to do that. It's cognitively draining. And it takes a lot of energy to do that. And people don't want to do it. They just want the to-do list. And every coachee I've ever had resists that. But then at the end of the sessions we have together, the period of time that we do coaching for, they'll always turn around and go, that was the moment. That was the pivotal moment. The question's why. And the why that comes out of that is if they create almost like a straw man or woman version of themselves, and that person, the person they want to become, they can compare themselves against that and kind of go, okay, well, if that's what I want to become, that's the destination I want to achieve, what do I need to do and what do I need to not do anymore? And by understanding stuff like your values, your personal values, you can then hold them up against the company you're going to work for, the leader who runs that company as well, and start comparing things to go, there's a huge mismatch here. There's a gap between my values and the company's values, so I'm not going to join that kind of company. Even bring it back to relationships. If we knew this stuff at the start of our relationships, maybe there'd be a lot less divorce rates across the world because we'd have a better sense of who we are and who then the other person are, and we aren't looking for the other person to complete us because we're going to be living together, almost cohabiting, which we do. And actually, the most healthiest relationships are like that, where each person has their own identity. And I think the same thing happens, Scott, for organizations, where there's first an onus on the individual. The individual must work on themselves first and understand themselves well. Then the organization starts to build on those people over time. The leader's job is to facilitate that environment where people can get coaching, can look for extra skill sets. And then I think when you have a mindset or a culture in an organization for that to happen, then the leader absolutely storytells a vision and a mission statement and the values over and over and over again ad nauseum, because most leaders, when you say it to them, they're kind of going, oh yeah, I talk about that all the time. And then you ask some of the immediate senior leadership team and they go, yeah, we're all on the same page. And then you go and you probe and they're all on different pages. And then you go lower down the organizations, and it just, the energy and the message disperses, and people don't have a clue what the organization is about. That ties back to what I was saying. I'm here doing my clean and jerks or my press-ups. And if somebody doesn't tell me why, my try starts to evaporate. So the whole idea is, if your why is bigger than your try, that's a very good thing, because it will drag you through those moments of obstacles and setbacks that you will inevitably encounter in any vision. You will always encounter challenges, and I see it as a milestone rather than a millstone. Most people reach that point of resistance, give up, and recoil back to safety. But instead, if you reframe it and use this mindset of permanent reinvention, you see it, actually, I'm making progress here. That's that thing that weirdo on that podcast was telling me about. And I've made a point of resistance. I'm pushing far enough. I think that's a really important aspect of all change, personal or organizational.
Did you know you can find us on Twitter at evolving_leader? We're also on Instagram and LinkedIn. If you're on any of these social media platforms, we invite you to follow along and comment on your favorite episodes. Now, let's get back to the conversation.
Something we're really interested in here is about accountability and mindset, because I think what you're pointing at here is that organizations are still on this journey from there being a vast number of people who are waiting for a small number of people to tell them what to do, even if they don't like it. That's the passivity that's inbred in lots of organizations, which makes it very difficult to change them. And what you're pointing to is, as all of these changes keep coming at us in wave after wave, we need everybody to be accountable. It's not just leaders, because if you don't know why you're doing something, if you don't know who you are in that situation, then you're going to be in perpetual chaos, overwhelmed by change. So what I like about your point there around accountability and having a clear understanding of why you're working for this organization, that you're not pointing at the organization, you have the clear answer for yourself, is that a mindset of permanent reinvention has to start with owning your own work, not expecting the organization. So not owning the inputs, but owning the outputs. Tell us a little bit about how that shows up for you in your work.
Well, I'll start, and I'll use that to build on what Scott asked me as well, John, because I think what we do in organizational change efforts is we try to bring everybody in this one big mass with us to the change, and that's not possible because everybody thinks differently. I think of the kaleidoscopes that you used to look through as a kid, and it shows you all this kind of dragonfly vision of the world. Everybody has a kaleidoscope and it sees the world differently, and it's like a kaleidoscope of kaleidoscopes an organization is. So everybody sees the same thing very differently. So the relationship to change is going to be very, very different. The relationship to even the vision or even to work ethics is going to be very, very different. And I think what we need to do is find pockets of excellence. And, in the book I talk about in the metamorphosis of the caterpillar to the butterfly. One of the reasons I talk about this is during that change, what happens is the first step is the caterpillar emerges from the shell and uses the shell from which it came as fuel for its future becoming. Then it goes through incremental growth as it grows bigger and bigger and becomes a better version of what it used to be, a bigger, better version, eats multiple times its body weight, grows bigger. But then what happens, and I think this is so apt for organizational change, deep within the caterpillar's DNA are pre-programmed cells named imaginal discs, named after the word imagination. They come online at a certain point in the life cycle. And they're so alien and so foreign to the DNA of the caterpillar that the immune system of the caterpillar starts to attack them. But in time, they resonate at the same frequency, communicate together, come together, and induce the caterpillar to become the chrysalis. In the chrysalis, it's very painful. An enzyme is released. The caterpillar melts down into this soupy fuel, again becoming fuel that will become the emergent butterfly. So there's a cycle of using what you used to be to fuel what you're going to become. And that's a key point in the whole permanent reinvention metaphor. But the other one is the imaginal cells made the change happen. These were these very different cells within the DNA of the caterpillar that were immediately attacked. And this happens in organizations where the corporate DNA attacks, the antibodies attack the change makers. But you need in time to have enough of those change makers together to have solidarity, to have each other's backs, to protect each other, to give each other support. And in time, they'll create a tipping point, almost like a network effect within the organization. And if a leader gives them an environment in which they can succeed and then celebrates that success, you'll get what I call, and I didn't have this in the book, I call it the curtain twitcher effect, where you have that neighbor who's kind of looking over and kind of going, what's the Allender's got? Oh, he's got a new car. Hey, did you see that, Mary? Come on over here. And if you can create that in the different levels of appetite to change, if it's a spectrum of change throughout the organization, and you have the guys who are most closest to the imaginal cells going, I'm going to have me some of that. The leader's looking at it, giving it some attention, and then they'll join. And then the next compartment over, they'll join. And then in time, you'll end up always with the laggards down the bottom of the spectrum who won't want to change. These are like the people who, despite multitude of updates on the phone, the little red dot to go update your operating system or the phone's not going to work anymore, they won't. And then you have to introduce some real problems for them in order to upgrade their operating system. Same thing happens with change initiatives. You need to make it so uncomfortable for them that they're either going to have to leave the organization or they're going to have to change. And that's the way to do it, is start with the excited imaginal cells in the organization, create excitement around that as a leader, create the environment for it, and then everybody else will follow. One other thing, because I know this is important to you guys, in the organization, I often think about the culture the leader creates is kind of like the idea of the farmer. And a farmer doesn't make crops grow and go, grow crops, God damn it, come on, kicking them and, slapping them around the place and using the stick. Instead, creates the right soil, the right environment, adds nutrients, waters them, pulls the weeds when it's important as well. And then the crops will grow naturally because they have the right environment. They'll flourish in that environment. And I think the same way to think about leadership in organizations. You create the environment, you reward the behaviors that you want to see, you punish or you don't reward the behaviors you don't want to see, and then we're just animals. We'll behave that way. We'll always go towards success and how we're rewarded and away from pain. And if it's more beneficial for us to go towards change and away from stasis, then we'll do that. And I think, we're just big amoebas and some of us more amoebas than others, given my rugby career. But we'll actually always move towards sugar and away from the bitter, away from the acid. So I think that's a really good way to think about it.
Where can people get your book? I'm assuming it's everywhere.
It's everywhere now, thankfully. It's on audiobook as well, not read by me, for those who are like, thank God, I'll definitely get it now. So, although they
Brian
got
O'Driscoll's reading it, is it?
they got an Irish guy to read it, and it's a bit Irish accent in an American movie style. So I don't know whether they did that for an American audience, but it's out on everywhere you can buy audiobooks. It's on Amazon all over the world. And yeah, anywhere you buy books. I don't know about local bookstores across the world, but certainly it's anywhere you buy books. And you can find me on the innovationshow.io. And the reason I chose .io, by the way, is the same reason I said what I said at the start. .io stands for input output, and I see the show as an input of information, and then the output of the show is the output of that information through articles or books or whatever way I can synthesize it for the audience.
Well, thank you. We really enjoyed reading the book, so thank you, Aidan, for coming on. It was a real pleasure.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks, guys.
So until next time, remember, the world is evolving. Are you?